All right, well, we've been talking about interpersonal attraction. So it's only natural to move next to the most important facet of probably of all human endeavor. Yes, we're going to talk about love. So one of the ways to think about love is to ask that question, what is love? And so later on, you'll have an opportunity to get into groups and ultimately answer that age-old question. Come up with various components of love. What is a loving relationship? What does it mean for two people to be in love and show love and share love and so on? But before we do that, I want to talk for a little bit about the difference between love and infatuation. Because I think for many of us, we've been in situations in the past where we thought we were in love. It felt like love. And might have told people, I'm in love with this person. Or maybe you weren't sure whether you were in love or not. But nonetheless, let's explore a little bit about contrasting what infatuation might be like with what love might be like. So let's go through, I think we'll have 5 or 6 different ways to contrast it. So kind of picture over here we have infatuation, and over here we have love, okay? So number 1 is that infatuation, whatever it is, it tends to occur at first sight. You hear people say, she walked into the room and I was in love. Or, yes, when I first saw her, I knew I was in love. Well, that's not really love. Because what we know love is, and so we can kind of contrast this on the other side, is that love takes time. Whatever love is, it doesn't occur immediately. Now, I'm not saying that people can't be attracted to each other immediately. They can't have some chemistry where they are, certainly focused and interested and maybe feel like they're in love with that person, but that is not love. That is infatuation, where it feels like love. So, on one hand, infatuation is something that takes place at first sight, whereas love is something that takes time. And now, can you move from infatuation into love? Absolutely. Second is that in infatuation, you know little about that person. In fact, the less you know about that person, the more you can, kind of see in that person what you'd like to see in them. Think what word that might be, where we have feelings, thoughts and ideas inside of us, and we see those in fact in the other person. What's that concept called? Yes, called projection, right? So when we first meet someone and then we are infatuated, we know little about them, right? And so what we know about love is that we know them well, right? That you know everything about that person, and yet you still love them, and they know everything about you, despite all of your shortcomings and failings and so on, that they still love you. Okay, so knowing them well. Third is that in infatuation, quite often you can't be yourself. The idea here is that if I really show my true self, remember we talked earlier in the quarter about Carl Rogers and the different parts of the self concept, the self that we think we are, the ideal self, the self that we'd like to be, the social self, how other people see us, and the true self, the person that we actually are. And so I think for many people early on in a relationship, it's like, well, I can't show them what I'm really like, because if I do, then, well, guess what? They won't love me, because they'll realize, oh my goodness, you're this way and that way and so on. And it's like, so what happens is early on people can't be themselves. Whereas in love, you can be your true self. You can show that person who you are, and as I mentioned a minute ago, they still love you and care for you and appreciate who you are. So it's being your true self, feeling comfortable with who you can be around that person. So let's see, so what do we got so far? We got number 1 is that infatuation occurs at first sight, but that we know, in fact, in love it takes time. And infatuation, that you know little about that person, but in love you know a lot about that person. Third is that you can't feel in infatuation that you can be your true self, but in love you really can show who you really are. Number 4 is that infatuation is based more on rewardiness, right? That once we get thrown together with a person, remember the term proximity, that what happens is that we tend to be attracted to them because of rewardiness, because of how they look. It's like, oh, she's so gorgeous, or he's so handsome, and he looks so cute, and she's beautiful, and all that, right? Or that another part of rewardiness is that, he says all these nice things to me, and he's so sweet to me, and he's so nice to me, and he does all these things for me, and so on, right? Which is all part and parcel of what rewardiness is all about. Whereas, in fact, in love, what the important thing is, as we know, is similarity, right? Where rewardiness might put you together at first, it's similarity that's going to keep you together. It's, as we mentioned before, those similarity in terms of beliefs and interests and values and attitudes. So that's important. Another facet of infatuation is the idea that for some people, sex equals love. That is that, engaging in sexual intercourse is somehow proof of one's love. You hear sometimes people appeal to, show me you love me by having sex with me, or just the term making love. I mean, think about that. You're making love. Somehow you're creating love out of that situation, and that's that's not really what we're talking about. Whereas in a true love situation, it's entirely possible to be very much in love and not have sex at all. Now, later on, that certainly may be the case, but one could be very much in love and not engage in sex. Now, I'm always concerned that when I say this, I'm going to get, an email from someone's boyfriend saying, thanks a lot. She cut me off last night because of your lecture. But nonetheless, it's important to keep in mind that, yes, later on in a relationship, certainly people can engage in sexual relations, but by having sex doesn't necessarily prove that someone's in love. And then number 6 is that that quite often infatuation is unhealthy. That is that people talk about being lovesick, or there's so much in love that they can't see the negativity in that other person, as sometimes happens with abusive relationships and so on. Or here's two guys talking, and I guess, so how about that gal you've been seeing recently? It's like, oh, I think I'm in love. Oh, well, how do you know? I threw up last night 3 times. Like, oh yeah, man, you're in love. That's love. And I'm like, no, that's not what love is. Love is, if anything, it's healthy more than unhealthy. It's feeling good about that relationship and not being involved in abuse or putting the other person down and so on. And so while infatuation could have unhealthy aspects to it, love is healthy. Now, that said, what I want to talk about next is something that I always look forward to talking to at this point, because it's one of those times in which I know that students are never going to forget what I'm going to say next. Now think how good that makes a teacher feel, that knowing that the topic that in this case I'm going to bring up will be something that you'll remember years later. Okay? And so here's the topic. Here's the story. There's a backstory to it. Actually, in a moment, I'm going to give you something called the Wagner Test. Okay. Now, a little background on this Wagner Test. It's from a professor that I had at the University of Washington back in the 1970s, and his name was Dr. Nathaniel Wagner, and he was quite a remarkable professor because he was the first professor to offer a course in the psychology department at the University of Washington on prejudice and racism. And I think he first offered the course in like 1969, which was just, way ahead of his time, just unheard of that someone would be talking about race issues in the context of, the racial tension that had been going on in America during especially during the 50s and 60s. So, but he also was the first person to create a course called Human Sexuality at the University of Washington. And so there I was, a new student back in 1970 or so, arriving at the UW, pretty scared, thinking, oh my goodness, what am I doing here at this big institution with all these thousands of what appears to be very smart people. But I was looking forward to being taking his courses, and so I remember the first quarter I signed up for his racism course. And I walked in there, like a couple hundred people there, and I remember thinking, I wonder what Dr. Wagner looks like. I wonder, what would a person look like who's created a course in human sexuality? Because this guy was famous, and no one had ever. It was probably the first human sexuality course in the entire northwestern part of this nation, and this was the guy. So I remember thinking, back then there was this guy named who was the Playboy editor, Hugh Hefner, editor of Playboy magazine, and I remember thinking, well, maybe Dr. Wagner, maybe looks a little bit like this, suave, debonair guy, So I remember this guy walked in, and he started talking, and I'm thinking, for a moment, I'm thinking, well, maybe this can't be him. Maybe he's going to introduce, this famous Dr. Wagner. This guy was like overweight, had a beard, mustache, had black rimmed glasses. He talked with a lisp, and I'm thinking, no, this can't be. Yeah, this is Dr. Wagner. This is a guy, this famous guy. Like, okay, so I took his racism class, and it was so good and just blew me away, like the other students as well. And so the next quarter, I signed up for his human sexuality class. And I was married at the time. I had a kid, and it's like, all right, I'm taking a class in human sexuality. I mean, how much more can you learn, right? I walk into the classroom. There are 1,000 students in this lecture hall. I'm thinking, holy mackerel, this is the most popular class in the entire university, and I get to sit in on it. So it was an amazing class. He taught us so much. He opened our eyes to so many facets of human sexuality that we just not considered before. But about halfway through the class, he then began talking about relationships and about love. And he there he is down there, 1,000 of us taking notes and all that, listening to him. So he says, today I want to talk for a moment about, I want to give you a test. He said, I don't know what to call it, so I'll just call it the Wagner Test. So he gives us this test, and we're just in hysterics. This is like the funniest thing we've ever heard. And so I remember years later, I had gotten my master's degree, and I had ended up teaching a course in racism, and also was teaching a course in human sexuality myself. Just couldn't believe it. And my wife and I were at a conference for psychology, and she says, look, over there is Dr. Wagner. I remember thinking, holy mackerel, there's this famous guy, and I want to go over to him and I want to say, look, I took your class like 7-8 years ago, and I'm teaching the same classes that I took from you. I wanted to, but he was, talking to someone, and he looked very, busy and so on. And I thought I'd see him later on in the conference. And as it was, I didn't get a chance to see him. And a year later, at age 49, he had a heart attack and died. And then we lost him. This amazing person. I mean, he was on Channel 9. He was on PBS. People were like, talking about racism. They had another series on human sexuality. People were writing in like, get this dirty man off of television. He's saying words like penis and vagina and everything, and people were all upset. And it's like, no, finally someone was there to educate, the public. So that's the long story of this Wagner test, and it's sort of a dedication to my favorite professor, who is, surely understand, had a profound impact on me. So here we go. You're going to get now the Wagner test. It's going to take less than a minute, and then it'll be over. So you don't even have to write this down if you want. You're gonna remember this. Trust me. I run into students 15, 20 years later, and they go, I remember that day you gave us. They may not remember it was called the Wagner test, but they remember that moment that I took them through it. So here we go. You ready? All right. So now what I want you to do is I want you to go inside yourself, find a comfortable space. Right? You close your eyes if you want, stare off into space, but I want you to find this comfortable space. What I want you to do is I want you to think of someone that you've been in love with in the past, or you're not sure whether you're in love with them in the past, or someone that you're in love with now, or someone maybe that you're not sure that you're in love with now. And what I want you to do is I want you to see them sitting on the toilet. They have no clothes on. The door is shut. They are defecating, smelling up the bathroom. You're looking at this person. With one hand they are picking their nose, and the other hand they're scratching their belly and they're belching at the same time. Now I want you to take a good look at this person. And I want you to ask yourself, do I love this person? All right, now come on back. That is the Wagner test. Now what does that have to do with anything? It relates to number 2 on our list of infatuation versus love. That is knowing them well, right? I just put together a scenario for you that all humans engage in. And the question for you became, when you looked at this person, did you still love them? And that's called the Wagner test, because it says to you, yes, I know them well. So, the next time maybe your 14-year-old cousin or 16-year-old friend comes to you and says, I wonder if I'm in love. What you do is say, have a seat. I'm going to give you the Wagner test.